If you have your Bibles, please turn to Philippians 3, verse 10. This is our third Sunday lesson, um, and this is Easter Sunday. I don't know about you, but it feels a little bit strange to be at my house with just my family on Easter. Uh, in some ways, it doesn't feel like Easter, but maybe we can remedy that today with a good lesson and reflecting on all that Easter is supposed to mean. Philippians 3:10, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death. Today I want to talk to you from the title on this Easter Sunday 2020. This unique opportunity for a fellowship of suffering. This unique opportunity for a fellowship of suffering. Lord, we love you right now. We ask you to take the word, quicken it to our hearts and minds. Let us be encouraged by it. Let us be transformed and strengthened by it. In your name, amen. Well, as I mentioned, this is our third lesson of this sort on video from my home to your home. I hope you're enjoying these. I hope you're finding them useful. Which means this is our third lesson since going into semi-quarantine, secluded and only getting out and away from our houses in a very limited way and seeing other people. This will be the fourth actual Sunday that we've kind of been on lockdown this way. The first Sunday, I had not gotten the technology or the space ready yet, and so we didn't have a lesson. But so that's a month of Sundays of living this way, and here we are at Easter. You know, um, the the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection um, are considered through most of the Christian world as the central story of Christianity. That's not to say that there aren't other important stories in the Bible that are important to Christianity. Everything from the Nativity um, to stories about his ministry, stories from elsewhere in the Bible, later in the New Testament, for example, stories from Acts and about the apostles, and stories from the Old Testament about the prophets and about Moses. But few stories are as central to Christianity. Well, there are none. There just really aren't, regardless of how we may feel about those other stories. This one is central. Um, it brings us the central symbol that is universally recognized as the Christian symbol, and that's the cross, right? And we have heard the story, and we have spread the story so well and so often through the centuries that not only are we very, very familiar with it, but a lot of people who don't even consider themselves to be Christians are very familiar with it. The story itself is so prevalent that it not only pops up in its own form, but it's referenced. There are artifacts and symbolisms of it that are woven into stories and film and literature and painting and poetry. I mean, it's just it's just one of those things that is just so common throughout human culture because it's so old and has been so spread and told and retold for century after century after century. Now that creates um, some problems when it comes to how effective that story is at impacting us and impacting others. We know, we believe that as Christians, the story is supposed to move us, um, that it should not only move us, but we should be able to deliver it in such a way that it moves others. And yet there are several things that work against that. Um, the fact that it has been told and retold and retold and retold and retold. Anything that is told over and over and over and over again, well, it becomes, habitual. It becomes old hat. It becomes routine. That's the process by which things that are once very provocative and interesting and real to us slowly turn into cliches, right? And and a lot of times, to a lot of people, the story of the crucifixion and resurrection can start feeling that way. Not intentionally. It's has nothing to do with people not caring or not thinking that it's important. It's just the way the process of language and the human psychology works. Things we hear often over and over and over again, our brain starts to filter that out as white noise. So there's that working against um, the the impact and the power of the story of Easter. Um, it's been ritualized in Western cultures for more than 1,000 years, right? Um, and something else that works against that is often it's been used as a source to inflict guilt on other parties, right? Christians, Christian denominations have used that story as part of their ammunition against other denominations. You know, they find ways that their particular doctrine connects to the cross, and they believe that that's so compelling that other denominations who don't have the same doctrine suddenly, and they're in the original, the first denomination's eyes, they become, less appreciative or less connected to the cross. And in those cases, it becomes part of the propaganda war. Christians have used it through the centuries against Jews. It's been cited, the story itself has been cited repeatedly, where way before there was ever even explorers coming to the New World as as anti part of the anti-Semitic tendency and beliefs in Europe. Um, Christians have used it against non-believers, to try to say, hey, this is how much he loved you, and then guilt them using the details of the crucifixion itself, especially to try to guilt them into believing and accepting Jesus. Um, so in that way, it's become not only old hat, but to some maybe an old hatchet, right? And so not only do they hear it and their eyes glaze over, maybe they hear it and say, I don't want to hear anymore because of the way it's been used and probably misused. Um, and it's prevalent in today's media, as I've already mentioned. But also prevalent in today's media is other atrocities, right? Because of media, we have more exposure to, to wars and to killing and to deprivation and horrible things going on around the planet. And not only do we hear about them, but we're exposed to actual images of them. And so, whenever you want the story of the cross itself, especially when you think that those details should be visceral and should be uh, disturbing and should evoke a response in a believer, well, they're hearing you, but they're cataloging it among a vast multitude of similar images and stories. And whether we want to admit this or not, I mean, the crucifixion, there is no doubt that crucifying someone is one of the most brutal ways that people have been executed and tortured in history. But that doesn't mean there aren't other ways that are equally and perhaps even more brutal killings and just brutality that we've heard stories and seen things go on in the world that rival just how shocking the cross itself is. Um, and so whenever whenever the story of the cross is competing with those things, we can't rely on the shock value of the crucifixion to somehow move people. And I want to tell you something. We probably never should have relied on that anyway. The crucifixion definitely was brutal. And while there are depictions in the Gospels of the brutality that Jesus suffered, it's not nearly as detailed and visceral as we have made it. Now, I'm not saying we've added to the story. I'm just saying we have gone to great lengths, as our tendency is, to make it real. Um, and I'm not sure the value of using graphic shock, value of images and depictions. I'm not sure that's an ethical way to try to win people to your case. It can be perceived by some as emotional and traumatizing manipulation. So I don't think there's a lot to be said for that anyway. And nowadays, when people are exposed to that sort of thing on a regular basis, that means that particularly immoral tactic no longer has as much impact anyway. So hopefully, because of that, we can learn our lesson and put that very ugly tendency, behind us and try to reach out to people in other ways. We've known instinctively, I think, a long time that that story doesn't have the impact and shock value that it always had. And because we were already committed and believed that it was you know a perfectly fine way to try to reach out to people, we we would try to do other things and go further with that tactic. We would put it in our songs and put graphic depictions in our songs of the cross and put it with moving tunes and music and turn it into ballads that we would hope would move people that way. And then we would do things like create films, and even we have years and years ago Mel Gibson's movie where it became more and more graphic and tragic. And I don't know if you know this or not, but passion plays are a very old historical tradition. So this is an old thing that people have been trying for a long time. I'm sure there are modern twists on it, with the way we can have special effects to recreate pain and recreate gore, that have been added that they didn't have in centuries past. But we've been trying the same thing a long time, and the reason we do that, and the reason we try to make it more and more graphic, more and more real, more and more moving, is because on some level we realize it's not having as broad an impact as we'd like it to have. If it was, that's the only reason to amp it up and amp it up and amp it up. If it was reaching everyone the way we were telling it, say 40, 50 years ago, if it was impacting everyone that heard it and the world was coming to the church's doorstep and saying, please, I need Jesus, we wouldn't need to increase the imagery and increase the level of graphic depiction. But we have them. And we've done that because on some level, we want everyone to be reached. We detect everyone isn't being reached, and so we keep amping it up, thinking that the more graphic, the more visual, the more visceral, the more vivid, the more you're going to reach. Um, Now, I, like I said, in the Gospels, it does give some verses to how he was crucified, um, but it doesn't go into the depth that we've gone. And I think the reason is because the gore of it, the brutality of it, the torture of it, is not where the focus ought to be. I mean, if we look at our text, I don't think it's where the focus is. Um, the power we want is not in vivid storytelling and graphic depictions and shock treatment. The power that we're missing is built into a particular process And that process is depicted in the verse that we read and in the actions Jesus took leading up to the moment of death and to the moment of the cross. And I think it's captured in that phrase, fellowship of suffering, which is a part of our title. This unique opportunity for a fellowship of suffering. If you want to really move people and connect people and bind them to you in a long term way, there's got to be fellowship, there's got to be relationship. And this particular fellowship is a fellowship of suffering. In other words, um, for the Lord, that suffering was not just, him saying, "Look how much I love you. I am willing to hurt so you don't have to." Well, we love that in the West, in America, in other words. He suffered and died so I don't have to. Um, but for him, it's not just about him alone hurting. For him, it's a fellowship. For him, it's an act of connecting to others. He didn't come to only prevent suffering. He came to address suffering that was already going on. There were already people suffering and dying and hurting. So he was joining that fellowship. He was giving one more example in trying to understand and connect to us in a very real way. We've glamorized and fetishized the brutality of the death. We've isolated the whole phenomenon with our focus on joining it to a particular religion or denomination or faith. But according to his story, it was not about isolation. It was not about secluding himself away from others at all. And his goal was to, in fact, increase through that act who he was connected to. His death is robbed of its power when it is the only death that matters. I want you to think about that. His sacrifice is robbed of power when it becomes the only death that matters, the only one we think about, the only one that seems real to us, or that we want to focus on or want to be real to us. When we make it an elitist religious matter, when we make it a part of a very exclusive fraternity, it ceases to be a fellowship. It ceases to be a way that other people joined. Instead of a death that is one example of a horror millions have gone through, that others are suffering. We shouldn't isolate it that way. It's not about look what makes us different. It's look what he did to be the same. Only in America and the developed world can we say with confidence, he suffered so I don't have to. There are so many places and so many people on this planet who can't say that. The notion that they don't have to suffer, that is just fiction to them, because their lives are continual deprivation, suffering, bloodshed, starvation, hunger, loneliness. But here in the West, in the developed world in general, we have this very low, this very privileged notion of things. For us, the experience is no more real. Their experience, the experience of all those other people in the world, are no more real to us than his is. We have to keep amping up atrocity in our depictions of it because we're trying to make it real to us. While people around the world they don't need graphic depictions to understand what suffering means. As with his story, um, these horrors and horrors in general, always made possible initially, and this is something we've covered in lessons in the past, the capacity to hurt people that way, to cause horror, starts with the notion of distancing. You are better able to hurt someone and do a brutal and horrible, horrific things, commit crimes against humanity when they cease to be human to you, when you feel distant from them, when you're unable to empathize and feel their pain, when they become the other, the more distant it is, the easier it is to hurt it. Um, and so we've had a real problem here. Um, Not only does our very, comparatively speaking, I don't think that anyone under the sound of my voice, is going to file their taxes next year and claim that they made $3 million. I know we don't consider ourselves, wealthy or rich, um, but comparatively speaking to some other peoples in the world, we have a lot. We have a lot. It's really a rare thing for at least us, the people I'm talking to. I mean, there are people who are poverty stricken and are going hungry in America, and that's another reason why we have to climb out of this secluded place of privilege and realize that not so far away people are suffering. But for us, we don't have to think about that too much, um, and that makes it hard to empathize. It makes it hard to form a fellowship of suffering because we really don't suffer. Not real suffering, not the way a lot of the world does, and even people here in the United States, here in Maine, even here in the county, we just don't have that level of negative experience, and that makes it hard to have empathy for people who do. It's easier whenever you're distant from it to think, "Oh, that's terrible," and then go about your day and not think about it again the whole day, right? Because it's not real to you. It's a conceptual thing. You've heard people are hungry, but when you think of hunger, you think, "Oh, it's that momentary thing I experience before I walk in the kitchen to make myself a sandwich." We think of loneliness. Oh, it's that momentary thing until you know the spouse gets home from work, or it's that momentary pang I kind of experience a little bit until I call someone on the phone, or I open up the computer and interact with someone, or I'm around people all the time. Um, so it's hard to really have empathy and feel the weight of those things, and so it's natural for us when we talk about suffering to think of it as a spectator thing. That's the reason we make shows out of the cross. We make shows out of Calvary. We make movies out of Calvary. We have these graphic depictions and in sermons that are really masterpieces of storytelling. But for stories are for spectators. Stories are for bystanders, are for moviegoers. Stories are for people not involved. Stories are for people who want to be entertained. And we don't think of our services that way whenever we talk about the cross. But let's face it, as moving as some of those services are, right after that service, everyone's smiling, happy, clapping, waving, hugging, going out to eat, going back to life. That's not reality. That's not a fellowship of suffering. That's us going and seeing and partaking in a really, really sad show. However, right now, as I mentioned last Sunday, we're living in a new reality, aren't we? And there's a lot of really bad things to say about this reality, a lot of negatives. But I think we have opportunities here. As negative, as painful as this reality is right now, everything from actual death to sickness to financial, fears and people filing for unemployment. as negative as all that is, there are real opportunities here, as there always have been anytime the human race has gone through some tragic thing. First of all, suddenly we've been forced to slow down. Suddenly, the whole nation, the world, most of the world, has had to hit the pause button. Now, all of a sudden, we have time to reflect on who we are actually, not who we say we are, not who we claim to be. We finally can think about whether compassion is a word we say, is a characteristic we claim, or if it's actually a fact of the way we live, if it's actually demonstrated in what we do. Whether love, to use an old Christian cliche, love is finally a verb for us. Suddenly we have time, if we, as we reflect, if we realize, wait a minute, I've been saying I'm compassionate, but I haven't had time to do one compassionate thing. When's the last time I really helped a person in real need? When's the last time I really was even aware of other people's need? All of a sudden we can slow down and say, I don't think I can claim to be compassionate if I haven't loved. And I don't mean just feeling good. I mean, I haven't actively done something kind, done something that really changed and improved someone's life. I don't think I can claim to be compassionate if I'm not doing compassionate things. But now that I realize that, the time that's been given me here in my home, the few trips I get to go outside, when I go to walk or when I go to the store, as I'm reflecting and I have all this time to think, and I can realize, boy, I've been laying claim to a lot of characteristics, things that Christians call fruit of the Spirit. Boy, how have I actually been doing those? Wait a minute, now I can. Not only do I have time to realize that and to take stock, I have time to do something about it. I have time to call that person that I know is living alone. I have time. I'm in the store. Not everybody can stand in line outside in the cold wind 6 feet apart. I have the physical health that I can do that. Hmm. While I'm in here, I know I have a neighbor. I know I have a relative. I know I have a coworker. They're not physically able to do this. I'm going to pick up some staples. I'm going to pick up some vegetables. I'm going to pick up uh, some 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 household supplies for them. And I'm going to put that before I go home. I'm going to go by and drop that on their doorstep. We've got time to do that kind of thing now. We can actually be compassionate and not just say we're compassionate. Second of all, we have an opportunity, and this one, man, this is not an opportunity we would ever pray for, right? But it's here. This horrible set of events is also an opportunity to know what it is to finally maybe suffer a little bit. We don't want to suffer. I don't want you to suffer. But now I realize what I more in a more real way, what I what I'm hoping to help you avoid. We know conceptually I don't want people I love to suffer, but it's a often just an academic exercise, a thought experiment, right? But now, as suddenly I'm kind of worried about whether or not I can afford things. I'm really understanding what it means when I hear someone's going hungry. Suddenly, it's becoming a reality for a lot of people. Suddenly, what it means when someone says, "Oh, I've been so sick, I hadn't been able to breathe." Suddenly, you know, I know a loved one. I've been watching them struggling to breathe. I've been watching them fighting this illness. Oh, that's what it means to be that sick. And I don't think it's a coincidence that right now, with the threat of illness and death being more than a threat, first of all, it's actually hitting a lot of people. I don't think that the pain that we're under economic financially, I don't think that those things are happening, and that alongside those, I don't know about you, but I've really been witnessing, both in real life and through the digital connection. By the way, thank goodness that we had this technology when this pandemic hit. Thank goodness for that. I have decried it a lot. I think so I still know there are a lot of dangers and things with it, and we're seeing some stuff even now. Not everyone is being, kind and compassionate, but man, thank goodness for it. But I don't think it's a coincidence that while all this is going on, that both locally in real life and through media, that suddenly we're witnessing all kinds of acts of kindness, of goodwill, of compassion in action. Oh, that's a nice little catchy phrase, compassion in action. Yeah. Yesterday, this is a really small thing, but it's just one tiny example of what I've seen. I was away from the home in the vehicle. I'd had to go into town. And you know what kind of storm we got yesterday. Oh my goodness, we got some snow up here in northern Maine here in April. I bet I had 16 inches out here in front. I had to shovel two different times. Had cleaned snow off this vehicle uh, one time myself, and I think my wife had hit it again after that. And yet here I was sitting in a parking lot somewhere because I had to go out, and once again there's a big patch of snow on the corner of the hood. It was probably about the size, oh, I don't know, about three 3 foot by 2 foot. So it was a decent little section of snow. It wasn't terribly high or deep, um, but it was, probably 3 or 4 inches tall, and it was just sitting there, kind of perched on that guard that goes along the front of the hood, and caught there. Here comes a person, a stranger. I didn't know her. She didn't know me. She's walking by and she sees that on there. The vehicle's running, so I'm sitting in there. She knows I'm there. Well, she smiles at me and she takes her sleeve, because she wasn't dressed to be out in the weather herself. She takes her sleeve and uses it to wipe that snow off my hood, gives me another smile, waves, and keeps walking. Now her sleeve is soaking wet. She is going to be uncomfortable and probably chilled and cold herself for the next hour or so. She didn't have to do that. She didn't know me. And I'm seeing that sort of thing more often. I don't think that's an accident. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's people realizing that we need each other. I said this last week. It's easy to seclude yourself when you have an abundance of people and friends in your life. As long as you have that going on, you think you want absolute seclusion. But all of a sudden, a lot of us are getting absolute seclusion, and we're realizing, wow, those other people who had it were lonely and depressed and suffering. And suddenly we're realizing in this fellowship of suffering, wow, I need people. We need each other. People are hurting. Suddenly we're more aware of the connection between our actions and our character. It's one thing to say, oh, I love people, while we're talking and railing and mad and angry about them on Facebook. Mm. Folks, pretty is as pretty does, right? Yeah, yeah. And I would say that love is as love does. And if most of your actions beforehand, and most of my actions at times in my life, were all about trying to steer clear of as many people as possible and only selecting the few handful that I wanted to be around and being angry and railing at the human race half the time. Well, that's not loving anybody. Who was I fooling? Nobody but me. Well, suddenly we're aware that there's a real connection between our actions, our words on one hand, and our character on the other. You love people, and if you want to know if that's true or not, what are you doing that shows love, right? You want to believe you're kind to people, good. Then what kind actions and kind words are you giving people? How are you making their lives better and brightening their day? And another measure of whether or not you truly are kind and compassionate is who are you doing it for? Do you find yourself looking for every opportunity to do it to whomever? Or do you give it to select few? See, suddenly in this moment, in this fellowship of suffering, um, we're more aware of what it means to be alone. We're more aware of what it means to be worried about food and shelter and keeping the lights on. We're more worried about what it means to be sick. Suddenly, we're more aware of what suffering means and how it feels. That doesn't mean we've experienced the extreme still of a lot of people, but we're learning a lot about it, aren't we? So I don't think it's a coincidence that suddenly we're seeing these acts of goodwill of people reaching out to people. We Christians have tended to view Easter as sacred because of Him. I understand that. After all, Christianity is all about Christ. But I think it would be revolutionary. I think we could really have a broader impact on the world if we remembered why Easter was and is sacred to Him. We have made Easter sacred because it's about Him to us, but to Him, it's about people. To Him, it's about people hurting. It's about the fellowship of suffering. Let's join in His fellowship of suffering the same way He did. Let's do something loving and selfless for someone else. If you want Easter to be a celebration, if you want to end, to put a period or an exclamation mark on this Easter Sunday, if you want to end that day feeling like it was a wonderful Easter, I'm going to give you a formula that is guaranteed to win. find someone Find someone that's not the typical person you talk to and you care about. Find someone that's not they're not along your beaten path. They're not in your normal circle on social media. Find someone, especially if you can, who is lonely and sad, suffering, worried, sick. And if you can't go to them, if you can't bring them anything, if you can't love them directly with your actions because of this seclusion, give them the gift of a kind word. Give them the gift of your voice. Share this Sunday with someone else who may not have someone to share with. I love you. I hope your Easter Sunday is beautiful. I hope it's full of sunshine, and I hope it's full of acts of love and kindness. And if you need anything, please don't hesitate to call me. Have a wonderful Easter Sunday. I love you. Be safe. Be well. Goodbye.